everybody. Welcome. I'm Howie Howard from Mr. Furious Records. And today on Dat Fury Radio, guest MC Reach out of Kansas City. What's going on, Reach?
What's up, man? How are you?
Hey, I'm good. You are a returning... You have not been on Dat Fury yet, but you were on the long play multiple times. You were on a year-end music episode. Oh, and I'm so glad I mentioned that because you introduced me to Amber Mark. And I'm like the second biggest Amber Mark fan in the world now behind you. Right? I've got that right, I think.
I think it was Effie Curry that I introduced you to.
That too. Effie for sure. I'll have to go. I could have sworn you mentioned Amber Mark in the year end. I'll put it in the notes. I'm sorry if that's my mistake. Anyway, and we covered your album, Life's One Valid Expression, available at reach.bandcamp.com a couple years ago. Amazing record, and actually one of those songs coming up in my morning shuffle is what prompted me to reach out and have you back on the show. We got some questions. I'm going to ask you a question today, and you're going to ask me a question for another week. I'm not 100% sure what the release schedule is going to be. But my question, I'm going to tell you what the question is, and then do some commentary before you have to answer, because you might want a second to think about it as well. So
fair enough.
What I'm interested in talking about tonight is the different threads of influence on Kansas City hip-hop. And that's, of course, not to reduce it to any of those influences or any combination. It's its own thing. But I also think I hear some influences from certain scenes and less from others. Obviously, New York and the old school and the golden era is a huge thing. There's a real Oakland connection that I'd love your perspective on. I hear a lot of the Raucous Records stuff coming in the late 90s, early 2000s. Tech Nine has his own kind of set of influences. I feel like Mac Lethal has his own set of influences. So I'm just interested in your perspective on all of that. As my own background for this conversation, I read very carefully. I've got my notes up. KCUR and The Pitch both did really great articles for the 50th anniversary of hip hop a couple years ago. I'll link to those. And reading those, actually, I'm going to write up a long post on MrFuriousRecords.com to go along with this podcast. And I'm going to try and put it in chronological order with sound examples from YouTube or wherever I can find to do kind of a sonic history. And we'll see how far I get with that. But those two resources have been really key so far. And that's what I'm going to kind of base everything on, and then add in what you bring and anything else I can find in the interim. I'll probably have a few weeks to write that up. So I've said a bunch of things, but that's the discussion question. Like, where do you see those influences coming from on the scene as a whole?
Internally, meaning within the area, within the region, or externally?
Both.
Like coasts.
I was thinking more coast, but however you interpret it too, it's all a tapestry. So whatever jumps out to you as significant, Sure.
I think there's probably externally, obviously lots of influence coming from the West Coast. At the time there was a lot of dialogue happening between Kansas City artists and artists, many of which moved here, relocated here from the coast, bringing a lot of that sound and that influence to Kansas City. And then you had some early adapters here, artists who collaborated with artists from the West Coast, which also brought that sound to Kansas City and was deeply influential over artists that would come after. So I think the West Coast was one big influence on the Kansas City sound, on at least a certain segment of the Kansas City sound. And again, I think that was just from collaborations, Rich the Factor being one important piece on that chessboard. And then also just a lot of West Coast artists that were either coming to visit Kansas City or relocating to Kansas City, collaborating with artists. There were many of them were selling features to artists here. So I think those two things were a very big role and a very big part of what helped to craft a segment of Kansas City sound. But I think the other side of it is perhaps on the other side of the tracks, there's a deep East Coast influence as well. As you mentioned, golden era hip hop, which obviously doesn't just include that region, but it did, predate the Western revolution of hip hop. So you got that influence that came in as well, the early to mid 90s, which influenced a lot of artists on my side of the street, so to speak. Your artists like Pete Rock and CL Smooth, your Gang Stars, your A Tribe Called Quest, your De La Souls, that deeply influenced a lot of artists on the other side of the aisle, and the sound that they ultimately brought to Kansas City. So there's another segment of Kansas City hip hop which was deeply influenced by the golden era stuff that predated the West's control and takeover of hip hop.
Excellent. So on that West Coast side of things, mainly from the two articles I mentioned, I gather by the mid 90s, Rich the Factor was getting a good amount of radio play, like in Oakland. And I don't know, do you know anything more about the backstory of that, or how that came to be, or were you aware of that kind of at the time? As
I don't know that I was as intimately familiar with it at the time, but looking back in retrospect, I know he got a feature from JT the Bigger Figure. And again, he was really kind of one of the pioneers of working with artists from the West Coast. And there were other artists that followed. So naturally, that opened up a communications channel between Kansas City artists and West Coast artists. And again, it was a transient scene at that time. So you were getting artists that were coming here to do shows, to do features. And so that's what really sparked that part of the sound developing, was having somebody who was homegrown, working with West Coast artists, and then having West Coast artists just here, within the city limits, doing shows, working with artists.
Yeah, and sonically, and I mean, this is, I'm more aware of the stuff I like, of course, right? So I have my own kind of skewed perspective, not skewed, but I'm more inclined to the Oakland kind of stuff and Souls of Mischief, and more so than like L.A. And I know both sections of the West Coast, and obviously those are intertwined and everything too. Both sections were influential here. But when I listen to your stuff, or more of the stuff that I tend to gravitate toward, I hear more of that Oakland kind of influence.
Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of hip hop everywhere, and
Absolutely.
Certainly on the West Coast, you have L.A. and also Bay Area. I think have different, they're both gradients, and they have different sounds, different artists within that sound, as you mentioned. Some artists who maybe were considered more underground and quote backpack conscious, like Souls of Mischief, but then you have your Bay Area artists like E.40 and V.alid and that ilk. So
totally.
And all of them informed Kansas City sound on some level. I think maybe that underground informed artists from around here, certainly artists like Approach would say, I think, not to speak for him, but I think he would say that, some of those artists from the underground side of the tracks from the West Coast were influential over him. I can say for me, there were definitely some artists from the West Coast that were influential to me, Far Side, and just down the line, Saphir. There were so many other artists that were influential. So, yeah, I think it was a dynamic conversation from different ends of that spectrum.
Let me pull on some different threads. What do you feel or remember about influence from the South, from Atlanta or New Orleans or Texas or Chicago or Minneapolis or some of the scenes we haven't talked about yet?
Kansas City being a melting pot, I think everything honestly informs it. It would be a little harder to trace the specific aspects of those other regions and areas and how they influence the sound. I think it's a bit clearer if you look at, say, New York or LA, Oakland, as you mentioned. But I do think all of those areas informed what Kansas City has become. I think we've all taken a beat from all of those artists, from the Outkast, Scarface, from UGK. I think on down the line, they've all had an influence on some level. Some just clearer to spot and point out.
Yeah, and it gets more individual from some of those other areas, right? Like I can pick out individual Kansas City artists and maybe hear an influence from some of those places. But when I think about the scene as a whole, it's more the East and West as the bigger influences in my mind to my ears. Let me shift gears a little bit and do you remember the first local hip hop artist that you were aware of?
Honestly, probably Rich. Probably Rich was the first artist that I really had a chance to hear catalog and songs from. Like hearing albums, mixtapes, a number of releases. Rich was probably first.
Cool. Let me go back a little bit and I'm just going to mention a few things out of my notes, again, mainly coming from the KCUR and Pitch articles, but just some interesting stuff I found. So the earliest mention in either of those two articles about hip hop coming to Kansas City was attributed to DJ Von Zell Bryant, Captain Von Zell. They said he went to New York in 78. Got introduced. He was already a DJ, but had a trip to New York in 78. Got introduced to hip hop and was one of the earliest to bring it back and start incorporating it into his DJ sets in this area. DJ Fresh, legendary Kansas City DJ, started making pause tapes in 79, which is pretty amazing. And I found some kind soul. I don't know who. They've got a nonsense kind of username, so I don't know who this is. I found some DJ Fresh mixtapes from 87 and 88 that you can stream on, I think it was on Mixcloud or something. I'll link to those. But that was a super fun listen. Like the 87 one, and I don't know a lot of the artists. I don't know how many are local versus just old school stuff I hadn't heard before, but it's a wonderful old school sound, full of cassette saturation and everything, but a brand 90 minutes of brand new music to my ears from that era, which was just super fun to listen to. Do you have any thoughts on did you encounter those mixtapes at any point? Or I mean, that's probably elementary school for you, maybe getting into middle school, and obviously he continued making mixtapes and stuff.
Yeah, so those fresh tapes had many of them circulated through my childhood home. So I definitely heard a lot of what Fresh was doing. He probably would have been one of my first entryways to people that were doing hip hop in Kansas City. And so, yeah, absolutely is a part of my recollection and my memory of early Kansas City hip hop. But there is a, as you mentioned, there is an era that predates that, and some artists that go back even further. And I won't try to recount the names because again, that's some really, really early history. But I recently had a conversation with with Jazz Brewer. He's an engineer at 64 111 Studio. And we talked about some of those early artists, some of those pioneering artists from that time. So there's a whole cross segment of artists that don't maybe get discussed as often as they should. But Fresh was certainly part of that early revolution of artists that were doing things here.
So and there's going to be omissions here, and I apologize for that. I'm just learning. So I should say, like, my personal interest, I moved to Kansas City area summer of 2005. So that's 20 years now. Reach's album at the time was one of the first probably 5 CDs I picked up locally, which is super fun. But I found, from these 2 articles, they attribute the first Kansas City artist to make a rap record. They attributed it to Laugh and Dance by Omer Coleman II, a.k.a. Starship Commander Woo Woo. You can find that on YouTube. That's 81. In 82, the funk group Bloodstone had a song, Funkin' Around, that had a rap verse like mixed into the bridge. So definitely the influence, whether you call the song as a whole the rap song. Mm-hmm. Make your own judgment there. And then definitely by the time you get to Butt of the Cut by DJ Cut Fast, I believe that's 89. So those are just some of the names. I'm sure we're missing folks. Hopefully I'll find more from that old school era in Kansas City to put into the article on MrFuriousRecords.com. But that's some of the early stuff. Did I miss anything from that that just jumps out from your memory? I'm sure you've heard stuff from that era, but it may not be on the tip of your tongue,
Yeah, like I said, I would say that would be, I don't want to do myself a disservice with some of the artists that just predate my entry to Kansas City hip hop, but I know it goes back, and I know it goes back to, in many cases, late 70s, early 80s. So in a lot of ways, tracks along with hip hop's history elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't long before Kansas City got involved. Within that first 10 years, Kansas City was involved in making hip hop.
Definitely. And I'm coming at this as a learner, so I'm happy if people have names they want to throw in. You can reach me via the contact form on the Mr. Furious Bandcamp page. I'll be at it. Whatever I end up posting, I'm sure we'll discover more stuff and I'll add to it, because as good as the articles I read were, I wanted to hear this stuff, and I wanted to hear. I'm got a little bit of a historian in me. I want to hear it like in chronological order and see how the scene developed. So I'm going to do that as much as possible, and I welcome people sending additional stuff in, especially from that early era. If it's on YouTube or whatever, I would love to add it. Where should we go from here? I mean, once you get through kind of the mid 90s, I feel like there's so much hip hop happening. It's hard to trace. It's hard to name, and tech kind of looms large over all of it, rightly so. But there's just so much, it gets hard to decide what to cover.
Yeah, I think that's always the challenge when people decide to talk about Kansas City hip hop history, is what timelines they're going to discuss, right? And so the coverage that you mentioned for Hip Hop's 50 has a specific focus, right? Mm-hmm. And it's focused on a particular segment of Kansas City hip hop, but there are other segments. And so, it's always interesting when you talk to people about that history, which aspects of that history they focus on. For me, it's always been the most interesting part is finding out where those different timelines overlap. That's always been one of the more interesting points to me, because there are some overlap points that don't often get discussed.
Are there any you'd like to discuss? Anything jump out in your mind, or the strain? You mentioned strains that maybe get less attention. Let's put a little attention on some of them.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, they're about, one could argue, but from my perspective, most of what has developed in Kansas City hip hop has come from one of three trees. The Icy Rock tree. Icy Rock is just a staple of Kansas City hip hop in terms of being an engineer and a producer. So the Icy Rock tree, the Flavor Pack tree, and the Heat Mob, pre-Heat Mob tree.
Okay.
And so I feel like a large percentage, probably 90, something in the 90% range, has all come from one of those three trees. In some places they overlap. For me, I have roots in a couple of those trees. Having, my earliest studio sessions were at Icy Rock's home in Midtown. So coming through that pipeline where, that's where that's where Tech Nine and RDV, that's the pipeline that they come through, that Icy Rock pipeline. But then also having roots in the Heat Mob, pre-Heat Mob days, Basement Chemist, Jock Max, Taha, Jay Lee. And then, the two of them would go on to create a hip hop collective called Heat Mob. Mm-hmm. I also have roots in that tree. The first artist that I collaborated with was a member of Heat Mob, and then later defected to create his own label. So that was my origin story. So I've got roots in both of those trees. And many artists have roots in the Flavor Pack tree, doing shows with Flavor Pack back in the day. And mm-hmm. There were a number of artists that came through that pipeline as well. So, for my money, those three trees account for most of what Kansas City hip hop is today. It's developed and evolved over a couple different generations, but
right.
But I think most people probably have roots in one of those three trees.
It's almost like a coaching tree in sports.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, I'm guessing that a lot of people like you cross over two or all three of those, in addition to having artists that are more associated with one specific one.
Yeah, I would say that I do cross-sect with Flavor Pack, but much later.
Yeah.
In the early days, my roots were in that Icy Rock tree and in that pre-Heat Mob tree.
What jumps out to you from like the mid 2000s or just the 2000s? Because when I dug into that era, just from my own collection, my own listening, it's much more Lawrence focused. So what jumps out to you from like roughly, 15 to 25 years ago, 2000s, Kansas City?
Yeah, I think that's where you saw a lot of artists from what I would call my class releasing albums. My first album was early 2000s. And by that time, you're getting releases from artists like The Guild, from Cess Crew, from Approach and Lawrence, from Nesbeat and the late Isaac Dio, ID, from, Brother of Moses, from Negro Skull. They're just, a number of artists, I would say, from that class were all releasing records and performing shows at that time. So it was pretty expansive across the metro, at least from this side of the tracks. On the other side of the tracks, obviously you had Tech, Vel Bacardi, a number of other artists that, most people would consider east of Truth, comparatively, from my side, more west of Truth artists. But yeah, a lot of people at that time, just considering where the technology was and how much easier it had become to release music, that's where you started to get a ton of releases from artists.
Just a proliferation. I don't have an ending in mind. Like, we could just go forever, listing artists and doing different eras and stuff. I don't know. I didn't have an ending in mind for this question or anything like that. I mean, I guess maybe that's perfect, right? Because it just continues to evolve, and
yeah,
I'm always so happy to go back and discover there's so much music, great music, that I haven't heard yet. And I think that's just always true, right? There's no end to that. If somehow you finish Kansas City, will you just, go over to St. Louis or down to Dallas or something and start all over again, and there's a whole nother world to dig into, and I love that. Yeah, I guess maybe a way to tie a little bow on it is just, is there anything, pick one or two things if you can, just like stuff we haven't touched on yet from any era that you think is really important to the story of Kansas City hip hop.
And I think is important.
Or influential, or however you define it. Maybe it's personal. I don't know.
I would say maybe more so than the artists were the channels that people reached the artist through. So local radio shows, different weekly, bi-weekly, monthly events. I think those are important. I don't think those often get discussed. When we talk about Kansas City history, we don't often talk about the ways in which people found some of these artists. Mm-hmm. Massive Mondays was a radio show on KKFI, community radio. That was a very important piece, I think, for a lot of artists from both sides of the track in platforming artists in a way that wasn't happening on, other FM stations in Kansas City. Massive Mondays was a huge part of artists being able to get radio play and to be heard. So that being a big part of it, open mics and weekly events like, Central Hot Zone was one important one that happened in the Vine District at a place called Club Mardi Gras. This was an event that was hosted by Heat Mob at the time. So, I met many of the artists that I'm friends with now and have been friends with for decades. I met there for the first time. Cess Crew, Tech Nine, my buddy Clarence Draper from the Guild, Vertigon, many of the artists that I know now and have collaborated with, that's where I met them. So I think those are important flashpoints in that history too, is to talk about the way, how did people learn or find out about artists in Kansas City? Well, that happened often through radio, Massive Mondays on KKFI. It happened often through weekly events like Central Hot Zone, like Hip Hop and Hot Wings, which was, much later, but there were many just kind of staple events like that where people were exposed to local artists.
Awesome. Thank you for filling that in. That kind of picks up from Fresh's mixtapes, right? And bridges to the era we're in now. A little bit with lots of, we can't possibly cover everything, but that's awesome. Thank you for filling some of that stuff in. Listeners, if you have things you want to add, go to mrfuriousrecords.bandcamp.com and do the little contact me form. That will come to me, and I'll be curious what you've got to add. I'll keep revising and adding to the post at mrfuriousrecords.com. Reach, do you have anything you want to mention as far as social media, events, stuff you're doing?
Yeah, you can find me on basically all of the major social media platforms at MC Reach is pretty much that's the handle on Facebook, X, Instagram, Threads. That's where you'll find me at MC Reach. These days we've got a monthly showcase for MCs and producers called Sammy Sheets and Friends that we do every month at Minibar. Next show is coming up in just about a week. It's on August 15th. It's a ladies' night version of the show. So all of the performers will be women from the area. So that'll be a very special edition of that show. But yeah, find me on social media, add me. I've got links to everything on those sites.
Beautiful. And Reach will be back next week for another question on Dat Fury Radio.